For centuries, scholars have pondered about the rise of Julius Caesar and his emergence into a tyrannical position in the early first century Roman Republic. The question is, how and why did this incident occur, particularly to a culture that looks down upon it? Should these incidents be considered natural for human society? The answers may not be simple and should certainly be interpreted on a spectrum rather than one fundamental cause. Furthermore, approaching the matter with a negative view on absolute rulers may be biased as well, because perhaps there is a particular time and space within a culture that requires it. First century Rome experienced what the political philosophers before them considered a crisis. Julius Caesar had assembled an army, marched on Rome, and eventually rose victorious from the civil war. Rumors and assumptions suffocated the minds of the Roman people and in their imaginations. More than anything, set a game of pretend in motion. Central features can be drawn from the nearly 100-year period between the Gracchus brothers and the death of Julius Caesar. That may explain how a political and ultimately cultural body accepts the transformation from a government based on commonwealth to one with a leader that has absolute power. The key events that should be considered when examining what led to the rise of Julius Caesar are broken down as such: the Gracchus brothers, the era of the Jovinetine War and Gaius Marius, the social war and the rise of Sulla, the matters between Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar, the Gallic Wars, and the Civil War. The first triumvirate and the partnership with Gracchus and Pompey was a key element that laid out the foundations for Caesar's rise to dictatorship, because it gave him the means to promote his self-interest in a political sector and helped him gain command over the campaigns in Gaul. Today, for the purpose of this class, I decided to speak about Caesar's expedition in Gaul in regards to the topic of this analysis. So let's begin. Caesar's expedition in Gaul was his most significant military assignment. In the 7 years that he spent there was not only 7 years that his army continued to improve tactically, but also hardened his forces in harsh conditions that resulted on the frontier of war. In addition, Caesar's character as a commander should also be regarded when examining his ability to effectively build a loyal army, conquer the Gallic tribes, and eventually march on Rome. And here's a map of Gaul, if anyone's interested. The best way to understand the character of Caesar is in the account Plutarch gives, and by analyzing the words of Caesar himself in the commentaries of Caesar. While Caesar was a notable politician, he was an absolutely brilliant commander, and Plutarch states it best as such, quote, "Those many expeditions in which he subdued Gaul showed him to be a soldier and general not in the least inferior to any of the greatest and most admired commanders who had ever appeared at the heads of armies. For if we compare him with the Fabii, the Metelli, and the Scipios, and those who were his contemporaries, Sulla, Marius, the two Luculi, or even Pompey, in war, we shall find Caesar's action to have surpassed them all." End quote. This statement speaks volumes about Caesar's ability to command, because Plutarch is putting Caesar on the same level as the best Roman generals during the Republic, but even goes farther by declaring that Caesar exceeds these generals in the art of war. The reason Plutarch lifts Caesar above the rest is because of the circumstances and environment he was working in, the vast range of land he subdued, and the size and strength of armies that he overcame. Additionally, what is even more fascinating is the way Caesar treated both his defeated enemies and the troops under his command, which demonstrates his character in a leadership position and displays the humanity in his nature. For those he conquered, he received compassionately. For those that helped him conquer, he showed appreciation and fairly rewarded. This explains why Caesar had soldiers that were highly loyal and willing to confront any of the most terrifying opponents on behalf of him. The best source by which to understand Caesar's warfare operations and vision on the battlefield during the Gallic Wars is by reading his writing on the matter. Two features in the commentaries of Caesar that exemplifies his intelligence as a commander. His ability to collect intel on the enemy, along with his awareness of how cultural norms influence their strength and methods of fighting, and the adaptiveness of both himself and his soldiers. Although Caesar used spies to gather information on the opposing armies, location, formations, and numbers, he also understood that both cultural and environmental factors affected warfare as well, and took advantage in learning the customs of his enemy and the context in which they lived. There were two important examples of this, the first being his description of the differences between the tribes in Gaul, along with their geographical locations. Quote, "The whole country of Gaul is divided into 3 parts. These all differ from each other in their language, customs, and laws. Of all these nations, the Belgians are the most warlike, as being the farthest removed from the culture. They are also situated next to the Germans, who inhabited beyond the Rhine, with whom they are continually engaged in war." End quote. Caesar, addressing this in his book, demonstrates his ability to collect a significant amount of valuable information on the Gallic cultures, and compare and contrast the individual societies to draw conclusions on their strengths and weaknesses both geographically and culturally. It can be determined that Caesar drew the conclusions that the isolation of the Belgian tribes would make their manner of fighting different, and therefore the way that he approaches conflict with them will be different compared to the other tribes. Furthermore, to better understand his opponent, Caesar analyzes the history and relationships the tribes have with the neighboring tribes, especially observing past conflicts between one another and their outcomes. Caesar infers that the subsistent habits and general lifestyle shaped their physical makeup, and that the people were well adapted to the freezing environment, more so than his own troops, which could make them a great threat. Additionally, he gives a description of the unique way that they use their horses in combat. Caesar's ability to react when circumstances suddenly change, including the adjustability of his officers and soldiers, revealed their training standards, their trust in Caesar's leadership, and discipline and duty. An example that shows Caesar's intelligence is how he was able to adapt the design of his naval ships after an unsuccessful attempt to cross the English Channel and land in Britain. He describes the changes he made as such. Quote, "He prescribed the form and the manner of building, ordering them to be somewhat lower than usual in the Mediterranean, for the convenience of embarking and landing his men. Frequent returns of the tide, there were less depth of water upon the British coast, built broader than ordinary, that they might receive the greater number of horses and carriages, and to be contrived for lightness and expedition, to which the lowness of their decks greatly contributed." End quote. His observation on the differences between the Mediterranean and the English Channel led him to redesign ships that were suitable for shallow water. His ability to adapt depending on the circumstances, whether it be caused by the environmental factors or military factors, and the fact that he had nearly a decade to gain experience and practice on both land and sea, certainly influenced his effectiveness as a commander. The events leading to the outbreak of the Civil War and the individuals involved in these circumstances played a direct role in the rise of Julius Caesar, The main factor why these events led to the Civil War is that greed, desire, and envy led to disunity in the Roman state. As noted, from the time of the Gracchus brothers to Julius Caesar's march on Rome, the individuals that hold their own self-interests before the good of the commonwealth did not take into consideration the negative impact their actions had on the general population. It seems as though they simply did not care. Caesar's opposers influenced his march on Rome because they were attempting to ultimately wrong him and were disregarding the law by doing so. In conclusion, there is certainly not a single cause for Caesar's rise to power, because the conditions in Rome in the century leading to the civil war between Caesar and the Roman state set the political and cultural foundations for it. The question is, what made the general public buy into Caesar's ideology? An answer can be found by examining the century of civil strife that led to Caesar, starting with the circumstances involving the Gracchus brothers, who fought against the greed of the wealthy and ultimately drove them to their death by the hand of corruption. A few decades later, egocentric generals, such as Gaius Marius, desiring for popularity, began competing against one another and further divided the Roman state. This division led to a civil war started by Sulla, who attempted to fix the corruption and disunity in Rome, but his harsh and short rule may have made matters worse. After Sulla gave power back to the state, corruption and the desire for power continued among certain statesmen, and also led certain individuals to form alliances because of their common interests, such as the first triumvirate with Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. Caesar was able to gain more experience and better himself as a commander during the war many years in Gaul, which gave him the tools that he would later need against the Roman state in civil war. However, a turn of events occurred when Pompey was persuaded to the side of Caesar's enemy, who aimed to fulfill their personal agendas by exploiting Pompey's popularity, slandering Caesar's, and dividing the alliance of the two most influential individuals in Rome at that time. Overall, thirst for power, wealth, and glory led to the corruption in the political realm, and the concern with one's own welfare over that of others created disunity within the Roman state. It was started by Rome's upper class, spreading quickly to the political realm, eventually making its way across the entire society. The unequal distribution of property and wealth in the community was aided by governmental policies, and the lower classes, especially the veterans that served the state, were not getting their fair share for serving the state. These circumstances certainly set forth the conditions for civil disharmony, which ultimately resulted in Caesar's rise to power during the Roman Republic. And if anyone's interested in any of the works cited that I used for this analysis, here are they.